Welcome back to the WHY-O-MYO Podcast. This is Janine Steen, your host, hoping to answer your who, what, when, where, how, and why questions when it comes to myofunctional therapy. Thank you for joining me again today. Today I want to continue reviewing the other areas that are typically adversely impacted by a tongue thrust. In my second podcast, I reviewed two of those areas, and I discussed that articulation, or the production of speech, is often affected by a tongue thrust, as well as an individual's ability to handle different or manipulate, chew, and swallow different textures and consistencies, and as a result have become averse to certain foods, and often wind up in that category as a picky eater. They're your chicken nugget kids and I like crunchy things and carb type things, but don't let me chew something that's multi-texture or has too much involved. Don't let me eat a bologna and cheese sandwich with lettuce, tomato, and mustard. I might have some bologna rolled or some cheese rolled. Those are typically some of the things we see when it comes to the symptoms that myofunctional therapy would help address, and how much the patient would benefit from that type of approach versus a traditional feeding approach. Anyway, the other two areas that I wanted to discuss that are often affected by a tongue thrust are your overall bite and occlusion, as well as your jaw. So it can be your jaw causing things such as jaw instability, difficulties with jaw grating, but it also has a lot to do with temporomandibular joint disorder and the difficulties and the deficits associated with your jaw's ability to be stable, to grade, and to securely keep that temporomandibular joint from working the way it shouldn't be. So in my last podcast, I discussed a video on YouTube that I thought would be beneficial, and I would recommend reviewing it again because it is also going to speak or be an amazing example of what I am discussing today. So the first thing I want to talk about is how a tongue thrust can affect your jaw, and how that tongue thrust then and its effect on your jaw results in temporomandibular joint disorder, and this can start from really, really young. The one thing that I always try to remind patients that come in with TMJ or temporomandibular joint disorder is that however they come in and however they present at the time of our evaluation, meaning if there's clicking or popping or grinding, that we cannot change what's already been done. So the goal of our therapy is to limit it from getting worse, to strengthen the muscles around the temporomandibular joint so that it's being utilized the correct way and not taxed incorrectly, and hopefully be able to limit any of the symptoms that often accompany TMJ. TMJ, or temporomandibular joint disorder, we see it in young kids all the way through adulthood. It is not restricted to one age or another. However, it is often something that the pediatric population, especially if they do not have all of their adult teeth, they consider teeth grinding and clenching, and thus the temporomandibular joint symptoms that occur as developmental. They're not as concerned about you clenching or grinding your jaw and the impact it has on your jaw, especially when it's your primary dentition, and until all of your adult dentition is in. As you get older, there are appliances and things that can be utilized to limit how much damage teeth grinding and clenching has on not just your dentition, but the jaw and the temporomandibular joint itself. So, and hopefully then limiting the symptoms. Many of the pediatric population that we see that already have symptoms of TMJ, or temporomandibular joint disorder, have no secondary pain or secondary symptoms as a result. Typically, when you do have TMJ, you can have a conductive hearing loss that has unknown origin. You can have headaches and joint pain and joint jaw locking and difficulty opening wide and difficulties or pain when chewing a piece of pizza or a bagel or even chewing gum. So when we're working with patients that, have TMJ, our goal is truly to strengthen all of the musculature around the jaw, so that we can hope to limit the pain that is caused or any other symptoms that are caused secondary to that tongue thrust that's affecting the jaw. So how does a tongue thrust affect your jaw? So ultimately, when you have a tongue thrust, you do not maintain your bite, thus not engaging or strengthening your masseter muscles, which then puts this adverse pressure and shifting on the temporomandibular joint. Oftentimes, the jaw will have to slide forward, or the mandible will have to slide forward in order to support the overall chewing pattern, and therefore coming in and out of its socket, or in and out of where it should be articulating with the joint. This is often why we see that these patients do have popping and clicking and pain in that area, because there is so much jaw sliding without strength in the musculature surrounding the jaw, as well as with the masseter muscles. So many times, as I said, that we cannot change what is already present when a patient comes in with temporomandibular joint issues. However, our goal will be to always strengthen and to hope to limit any progression or limit the number of symptoms that occur secondary to temporomandibular joint disorder. The other thing that's also important to remember is that teeth grinding is soothing. So when a child is grinding their teeth, it's just very soothing to a child. It sends a signal to the brain, and it helps them to relax. This is often why we see the children grinding at night. It's when they're absolutely relaxed, or it's when they're taking out all their stress and pressure of the day on their jaw. All of the research does say that temporomandibular joint disorder does have a social emotional component associated with it. So however or whenever or why you are grinding and clenching, there's something more underlying or under that's causing you to take out your stress and frustration and anger on not just your jaw or your temporomandibular joint, but also on your teeth. The last area that we often find is impacted by a tongue thrust and is in need of myofunctional therapy are those patients that has a tongue thrust that now impacts their overall bite or their overall occlusion. So ultimately, this can be affected not just by the tongue thrust, but could also be affected by any of the sucking habits that I had discussed earlier. The top of the mouth or the hard palate is malleable. It could be molded until the child's growth is complete. So for boys, this can be upwards of 21 years of age. For girls, we usually see it sooner than that. But that the growth in your palate, or the ability for your palate to move, or your hard palate to move, is affected by not just your tongue's contact with it, but can also be affected by your thumb's contact with it. So many times when we have individuals that are thumb suckers specifically, or it can be with pacifier suckers and long-term bottle feeders, we do find that the palate, or their hard palate, is high and narrow. It looks like if you put their thumb in their mouth and put it on the top of their mouth, the hard palate would shape to their thumb. And that is because the pressure from sucking on their thumb has literally moved the bone, and the top of your mouth is the bottom of your nose. So that pressure of moving that hard palate up has now not only limited the space in your mouth for your tongue and your dentition, but it's also limited the space you have in your nasal cavity. So we talk about these kiddos that have or enlarged tonsils and adenoids, and they may not be that big. However, the space they have to work with is also not big. And that can be due to a thumb. That also can be due to your tongue. So when you're a thruster, as if you just use the visual of a infant being fed cereal for the first few times of their life, that tongue moving back and forth is actually pushing up against the hard palate and forward. And the tongue muscle is just as strong as your heart muscle. So if there's a retainer or a habit breaker or an appliance or braces on your teeth, your thumb and your tongue are stronger than all of them. So this is often when a patient is a thumb sucker and they're pushing against their hard palate, they're also pushing against their upper central incisors, or their upper top two teeth. If you are a thumb sucker or you are a tongue thruster, that pressure again on your hard palate or against your teeth or between your teeth is changing the shape of your mouth. And when you change the shape of your mouth, it's important to adjust the function of your swallow. So if you are a traditional tongue thruster, as you should be as an infant, and you outgrow it naturally, the shape of your tongue should, as it's developing its adult or mature swallowing pattern, should shape your hard palate so that the tongue and the hard palate fit together perfectly. But oftentimes, if you were a long-term thumb sucker, or still a thumb sucker, or a long-term tongue thruster, and you thrusted and pushed on that hard palate for a period of time, and now as a result it is narrower and higher, now there may not be enough room in your mouth, and thus either you're pushing your tongue on your teeth, creating a malocclusion, or you're pushing your tongue against or between your teeth and causing an articulation issue, and then as a result of that, any spaces that are created that don't allow your jaw to close completely now will result in jaw sliding that will impact the temporomandibular joint. And the difficulties with the temporomandibular joint will limit the overall ability to chew, grind, break down, and swallow different textures and consistencies, therefore affecting feeding. So it literally snowballs from one issue into the next, into the next, into the next. However, it is important to realize that you do not have to have every symptom. Sometimes people come in and they just have TMJ. Others, they come in and they just have a lisp. Some will have all of them, some will have some of them. It is also important to know that a tongue thrust is hereditary. So there's a very good chance that somewhere, someone in the family also has a tongue thrust. But it also is important to realize that it does not have to manifest the same way, and it may not be something that's visible. For example, if we have a young patient who comes in with a lisp and we discuss family background and family history, and the parent wore braces, those two things would suggest that the parent had a tongue thrust as well as the child. these are just some of the scenarios. Sometimes there is no one in the family that has been identified with any of these symptoms associated with a tongue thrust. However, it does not mean they do not have them. These issues often become hidden or masked, especially behind very strong lips and a strong ability to breathe through your nose and keep a resting posture of mouth closed. And sometimes with those patients, we see that their issues start to present as they get older. And as they get older and their muscle mass is decreasing and their bone density is decreasing, all of a sudden these patients will come in because they can't keep their dentures in and their tongue keeps pushing them out. And then we know their thrust was hidden, or something catapulted it or made it more significant or pronounced as they got older, and as a result, it is affecting their ability to maintain their dentures. Okay, so at this point now, I have gone over the 4 major reasons, or the 4 major areas that are often affected by a tongue thrust and require myofunctional therapy. And to sum that up again, it is articulation, interdental placement of sounds that are not supposed to be interdentalized, as well as the vocalic R. I discussed the fact that chewing, texture, consistency, aversion, and swallowing is often a symptom that we do find. In addition to that, TMJ is also something that we often find benefits from myofunctional therapy and helps to limit the symptoms associated with TMJ. And the last and final is their overall occlusion. Do they have a malocclusion? Is their dentition affected by this thrust? Do they need braces? Do they need a palate expander? Do they still have any sucking habit that needs to be stopped? All of those things are ways that their tongue thrust will impact their dentition and thus require myofunctional therapy. Thank you, and I will speak to you soon.